Sleet stung Karen Stewart's face in thin, hard needles as she crossed the London coaching yard with the locked dispatch box braced against her ribs, her left arm numb from the weight and her right glove split open at the fingertips where wet leather had finally surrendered. Wheels shouted over cobbles. Horses stamped and blew steam into grey light. Porters called destinations in bored voices, as if lives could be sorted with trunks and tied tags. She moved between men twice her breadth, taking their elbows in her shoulders and their impatience in her shins, because a woman on business was an irritation, and a woman dressed as she was barely counted as that. Her boots had admitted water 3 streets earlier. Now each step made a small, cold sound inside them. Her stockings clung to her ankles like ice. She had eaten half a crust before dawn, and the ache in her stomach came in tight, twisting waves that made her breath shorten, then lengthen, then shorten again. A gentleman in a dark greatcoat glanced at the iron-hasped box in her hands, then at her face, then through her as if she were a hired cart. Another turned his shoulder so sharply that she had to pivot or be knocked down. She did not complain. She did not ask passage. She tucked her chin and kept walking. That was how one carried anything in this city when one had no rank to clear a path. One endured collision. One did not drop what one had been told to carry. Dark hair had worked loose from her pins in the sleet and pasted itself along her temples. Her face was pale with cold and too fine-boned for the rough wool she wore, a narrow face people called plain when they wished not to see it closely. Her eyes were large and watchful and fixed always on the next danger. Fragile, they said, because she was thin. They did not notice the stillness that held under pressure like tempered wire. She adjusted the box higher against bruised skin and kept moving toward the outbound carts. By the 3rd week of November, the yard clerks knew her by sight and not by name, which suited them. She was the copyist girl sent for errands no clerk wished to run in weather no clerk wished to face. Ink had stained the sides of her fingers a permanent brown-black, despite lye soap and cold water. The split skin along her knuckles had opened again that morning when she forced a stuck lock on a record's chest before first light. Salt from her own sweat stung there now beneath the wet. She had wrapped linen under her cuffs to hide marks at her wrists, but the cloth had shifted while she carried the box, and one purple crescent showed each time her sleeve pulled back. No one remarked upon it. No one offered to take the weight. 2 porters nearby laughed over a wager, and one said, not softly, that the plain one would go crooked by 30 from hauling men's burdens in all weathers. They were not entirely wrong about the burden. They were wrong about the rest. She stood in the queue for dispatch assignment while sleet gathered at the hem of her skirt and melted through. A stable boy beside her held a steaming meat pie in his bare hand and tore it open with his thumb. The smell of peppered fat reached her, and her stomach cramped so sharply she had to press her forearm against the box and lock her knees. She kept her face blank. Hunger was the one humiliation she refused to display in public, because pity from strangers cost more than bread from enemies. When her turn came, the clerk read the address on the tag, squinted, then flicked his eyes up and down her coat, as if measuring whether she would make it, and whether that mattered. "Blackthorn House! Immediate!" He slid the slate toward her for signature. Her pen strokes, even with a shaking hand, remained exact. Loop, stem, lift. Karen Stewart. The clerk looked at the line she wrote, frowned in faint surprise at its elegance, and then turned away before the ink dried, already calling the next name. She had inherited the hand from her father, and the debts from men who had never sat at his table. Once, in another winter, Mr. Stewart had bent over her shoulder at a sunny parlour desk, and told her letters were small acts of justice when the world refused larger ones. His script had been beautiful and clear, the kind judges trusted at first glance. His accounts had not been his ruin, though they had been called that after he died. He had signed instruments he did not draft, believing a partner's word over his own caution, and by the time the false obligations surfaced, he was coughing blood into folded handkerchiefs and asking Karen to read the figures aloud because his sight blurred at evening. After the funeral, the townhouse lease passed under terms she had never been allowed to inspect in full. Mrs. Whitcomb took the principal rooms and the silver and the mirrored cabinets, then sold Karen's mother's jewels one velvet tray at a time, always with a practical explanation, and always before witnesses who approved practicality in widows. Meals became a system of reward. Errors were counted where there had been none. Speech was rationed. Karen's pen became an income stream. Law clerks sent copied drafts to the house at dawn and expected them returned by noon in an improved hand. Mrs. Whitcomb collected payment at the door and called it household contribution, then handed Karen stale bread and said diligence should be sufficient nourishment for a grateful dependent. In the attic room, under the leaking slate seam, Karen slept with a basin beside the bed to catch the slow night drip. In the morning she emptied it herself before anyone woke, so no one would call it one more expense. She had one good shawl left, mended at both corners. She wore it now beneath her coat, damp and heavy and smelling faintly of old smoke. The dispatch box edge pressed against her side where last week's bruise had not yet faded. Pain answered each breath, quiet and punctual, as if marking time. The yard bell struck the quarter hour. A coach for Bath lurched forward. Mud flecked her skirt to the knee. She did not flinch. Work came in layers and she had learned to move through them without protest, copying contracts at dawn by candle end, so short it singed her fingers, carrying sealed packets through noon rain, reading ledgers at night by draughty window while laughter from the lower floors rose through the grates with roast meat she would never taste. Her body had become a ledger as well, raw fingers, swollen instep, shoulders corded from carrying more than she weighed. A cough held in the throat because coughing in front of employers invited diagnosis, and diagnosis invited dismissal. Even her silence had a shape now, precise and narrow and useful. She saved her voice for necessity. Once, 2 weeks earlier, she had corrected a date on a property transfer before it left the house, and the clerk who received it sent back thanks, addressed to Mrs. Whitcomb for her diligence. Karen had read the note, folded it, and placed it on the tray without a word. This was the ordinary theft. Credit moved upward. Blame moved down. She had ceased expecting correction from any quarter. Yet there remained in her a private steadiness that no one had purchased. When she wrote, the world became briefly legible, lines aligned, claims could be tested, lies left traces in slant and pressure and hesitation at the turn of a letter. She saw those things without trying. She remembered pages after one reading. She remembered signatures from years before and the slight tremor in a hand the day grief first entered it. On certain nights, after paid pages were done and the house slept, she drafted letters no one commissioned and signed only K.S. At dawn she slipped them into the correspondence box at St. Bride's, where strangers sought advice under initials and received it the same way. One recent note, from a newly bereaved father, asked what to do for a child taken by repeating fever. Karen answered with plain instructions and no questions. She never learned their names. In the yard, with sleet hardening at her collar, she repeated delivery codes under her breath so she would not misroute a single packet. Not because they deserved her care, because she did. because precision was the one dignity no one could confiscate once it lived in muscle and mind. A rustle of dove-grey silk cut through the yard noise before the voice arrived. Mrs. Whitcomb stepped down from a hired carriage and lifted her skirts clear of slush with gloved fingers that had never known lie, Rosewater trailing after her like an argument she had already won. Men turned to look, then bowed their heads in that quick social calculation reserved for expensive fabric. She crossed to Karen without haste, eyes bright with annoyance rather than cold, as if Karen's existence had become a small administrative inconvenience requiring public correction. "You are late," she said, though the church clock had not yet struck the hour she herself had given. Karen held the dispatch box tighter and inclined her head. "I was delayed at Chancery, ma'am. The packet was sealed after inspection." Mrs. Whitcomb's mouth thinned. "Do not explain. Deliver that box to Blackthorn House before dusk. Place it in the receiving clerk's hand. If it is not logged by 6, you will not return to my house tonight." The words were crisp and moderate, and perfectly audible to the men unloading trunks behind them. A porter glanced up, then away quickly. No one intervened. No one asked where a woman should sleep in sleet, if denied even an attic cot. Mrs. Whitcomb adjusted Karen's collar with 2 fingers, not gently, and smiled for the benefit of bystanders. "Stand straighter. You look like freight." Then she turned, silk whispering, and re-entered the carriage without waiting for a reply. Karen stood still until the wheels rolled out through the gate. Her cheeks burned, though her hands were near senseless. She shifted the locked box from one aching arm to the other, tested her footing in waterlogged boots, and stepped from the yard into Holborn traffic with sleet on her lashes and 6 hours of failing light between her and a door that might not open. She stepped off the curb into a wash of wheels and hooves, held the dispatch box tighter, and let the traffic take her in the direction of Holborn Hill, because stopping in that cold would mean stiffening, and stiffening would mean slowing, and slowing was the same as failing when dusk was already sliding down the chimneys. A brewer's dray sent up a fan of filthy water that struck her skirt and soaked through to her knees. She did not look back. A butcher's boy shouted as he ran past with a basket of bones. 2 clerks under one umbrella walked so close that the edge of it struck her temple, then kept moving without apology. She tasted sleet at the corner of her mouth. She tasted iron where her lip had split. The city looked grey and unmerciful and ordinary, which was the most exhausting thing about it. Cruelty here did not announce itself. It passed as routine. It wore polished boots and kept to schedule. Her father had once loved that precision in London, had praised the clockwork of post and court and carriage, had told her that a city ruled by documents could still be bent toward fairness if one knew where to place a comma and where to refuse a signature. He had taught her that before his coughing began, before his fingers started to tremble after noon, before he married again because a household needed order, and because grief made practical men choose the first competent hand held out to them. Karen had been 14 when Mrs. Whitcomb first crossed the threshold, not yet hard enough to mistrust Rosewater and perfect gloves. The widow had arrived with 2 daughters and 6 trunks, and the daughters had laughed in bright voices at the cracked paving stones in the back court, then asked whether the little attic room got rats in winter, as if choosing among curiosities at a fair. Their mother had bent to kiss Karen's cheek and said very softly, "You shall call me Mamma in front of guests." Karen had stood still under the scent, and understood at once that the request was not affection. It was strategy. By the first week, the breakfast table had changed places. By the second, keys moved from the steward's hook into Mrs. Whitcomb's reticule. By the third, her mother's portrait had been removed from the morning room and sent upstairs for preservation. Preservation meant out of sight. The two Whitcomb girls had taken possession of spaces, the way ivy takes a wall, gradual and complete. One had claimed the escritoire Karen's mother used for correspondence because the inlay matched her complexion. The other had selected Karen's winter mantle from the cedar press because it was lined in rabbit and she felt draughts in the carriage. They had done it while smiling, while asking whether Karen minded, while already signalling to the maid to fold the garment and carry it away. Karen had said she did not mind because her father was in the doorway, thinner each week and eager for peace, and she would not add one more strain to a chest that rattled when he climbed stairs. That was the beginning of her discipline, not silence born from weakness, silence chosen as triage. She turned down a narrower lane to avoid a stopped omnibus and nearly slipped where straw and mud had mixed to grease over stone. The dispatch box banged her bruised side and she drew breath through her teeth, then kept her pace. In the rhythm of walking she could still hear the scratch of her father's quill in those last months, lighter than before, as if even ink cost him effort. He had still tried to review every instrument brought to him. He had still tried to read without spectacles because he disliked admitting need in front of younger men from Chambers who had begun to speak slowly to him, too slowly, as if age had made him dull. Age had not done it. Betrayal had done it, and fever, and a partner who discovered that a sick man could be manoeuvred between medicine and midnight. Karen had sat at his left with ledger pages and sealing wax while rain worked down the window panes, and he dictated corrections in a voice that failed by evening. "Read it again," he would say, tapping a clause with a forefinger gone bluish at the knuckle. "Read the margin note, not the summary. Never trust a summary." She had read every word. She had watched his face change when figures did not reconcile. She had watched him recalculate, then recalculate again, because he believed error was more likely than malice, until evidence exhausted him. The evidence did. Too many endorsements appeared in his name on instruments he had never seen in full. Too many obligations matured all at once, each one legal in shape and rotten at the root. He had ridden to Chambers in sleet one morning to contest a transfer, and returned with blood on his cuff where he had coughed into linen at the curb and then hidden it badly. By December he could no longer stand through a client conference. By January he dictated from bed with pillows propped high and asked Karen to keep the fire low to save coal. Mrs. Whitcomb moved through those rooms with smooth efficiency, receiving visitors, refusing some, admitting others, always with grief arranged exactly on her face. She learned at speed which creditors could be delayed by charm and which by intimidation. She learned where deeds were kept. She learned which servants were loyal to memory and which to wages. When he died, the house smelled of vinegar and beeswax and burnt sugar from medicines reduced too long. He asked for Karen alone at the end. His hand was dry and light on hers, no strength left in it, but the pressure of his fingers at the final moment was deliberate. "Keep your name clear," he whispered, each word catching. "They will try to use your hand. Do not let them use your judgment." He had meant to say more. Breath failed him before he could. In the days after the burial, condolences came in folded cards edged black, then stopped. Receipts came next. Notices followed. Mrs. Whitcomb wept in the drawing room where she could be seen and did arithmetic in the study where she could not. She announced that economies were necessary. Economies began with Karen's meals, then Karen's coal, then Karen's bed moved from the small east room to the attic under the slate seam. The lease terms, she said, granted her full household authority as widow and guardian of dependents. Karen asked to read the clause. Mrs. Whitcomb laid one gloved hand flat on the document and replied, You may read what I choose to show you." The two Whitcomb girls, dressed in morning crepe trimmed with jet, watched from the doorway with solemn faces and bright eyes. By Candlemas, they wore Karen's mother's combs in their hair. By spring, they had sold the little travelling clock from Karen's room, the one gift her father had bought on circuit in York, because it was silver and fetched a useful sum. They called this realism. They called Karen ungrateful when she looked too long at empty spaces. A gust funneled between buildings and drove sleet under her collar. She hunched without slowing, past a bookseller's window fogged from within, and for one traitorous second saw herself reflected in the wavering glass. Narrow shoulders in a coat gone shiny at seams, dark hair escaped from pins, mouth set too hard for her age. 22, and already arranged by necessity into angles meant for work. Mrs. Whitcomb had discovered quickly what in Karen could be monetized. The answer was not beauty, which society had denied her with the lazy cruelty reserved for women who could not afford offence. The answer was script. Karen's copperplate was clean enough to pass in offices where clerks barely glanced at faces so long as lines were straight and flourishes fashionable. At first, Mrs. Whitcomb had framed it as household assistance. "Only 3 copies, child. We must all labour now." Then 6 copies, then 12, then entire packets delivered at dawn and required, by noon, legal drafts and shipping tallies and private agreements brought by boys who never stepped beyond the scullery. Payment was made to Mrs. Whitcomb at the door. Praise was addressed to Mrs. Whitcomb in notes tied with ribbon. Error, when a barrister misread his own dictation, belonged to Karen by decree before the page was unfolded. Food became contingent on output. If she finished late, supper was withheld because inefficiency could not be rewarded. If she finished early, more work appeared because idle hands encouraged self-pity. Bruises were explained as clumsiness, fatigue as female nerves. Once, when Karen's wrist swelled from hours at the desk and she asked for one evening without copying, Mrs. Whitcomb struck her across the mouth with a folded account sheet in front of both daughters and said, "You eat because I permit it. You sleep under this roof because I permit it. Ink is cheaper than your keep." The older daughter laughed first, then checked herself and looked away. The younger adjusted a bracelet that had belonged to Karen's mother and said, "Do not stain the carpet." After that night, Karen wrapped linen under her cuffs and learned to hold her pen looser when joints flamed, learned to flex fingers unseen below the desk, learned to stand while writing when sitting made her drowse. She also learned the small economy of concealment. She hid one stub of candle from each week's allotment. She copied paid pages at the household desk and saved those stubs for midnight, when she wrote letters no one commissioned, unsigned except for initials, to strangers who asked for help at St. Bride's. Those letters were the one place she allowed honesty to travel without permission. She advised a widow how to challenge a fraudulent rent increase by requesting duplicate receipts. She told an apprentice how to petition a guild elder without insulting him. She told a father with a fevered child to cool linen in vinegar, to darken the room at the height of heat, to mark pulse by the quarter hour and call a surgeon when breathing hitched below the ribs. She did not know his name. She did not know that the pages were being kept. She wrote because language had once been given to her as a tool for justice, and she refused to surrender that tool simply because men had stolen the bench it belonged upon. 3 days before this sleet, Mrs. Whitcomb had found a half-finished charitable reply tucked inside Karen's grammar book, read it, and smiled without warmth. "How touching," she said. "You give away counsel while owing me labour." Then she burned the draft in the grate and ordered 2 extra sets of lease abstracts before morning. Karen worked until her vision doubled. At dawn, Mrs. Whitcomb inspected the pages. found one blot where her hand had cramped, and withheld breakfast for carelessness. By afternoon, she sent Karen across town with a locked dispatch box and instructions delivered loudly enough for strangers to witness the terms of obedience. Deliver before dusk, or lose the attic bed. The threat had not been theatrical. Mrs. Whitcomb had put girls out before for less. Karen had seen one maid sleeping near the bakehouse wall in rain after being dismissed over broken china. She had brought the maid half a heel of bread and paid for it by scrubbing pans with split fingers at midnight. Holborn opened wider ahead. Carriages thickened. Bells rang the half hour somewhere behind smoke. She shifted the box to her other arm and kept walking. Each step a brief flare through wet wool and aching feet. Each breath a measured refusal to yield ground to pain or memory or fear. The inventory of her life moved beside her, as tangible as the iron-hasped weight against her ribs. A father lowered too early into cold earth. A second marriage that had dressed extraction in manners. Daughters who wore her inheritance in their hair, ledgers altered by hands that trusted she would never be asked to compare them, bread rationed as discipline, sleep borrowed beneath a leaking roof, labour sold under another woman's name. None of it had broken the one thing that mattered. Her judgment remained her own. Her hand remained true. Sleet struck her lashes again and blurred the lamps ahead, and she blinked it away, set her jaw, and walked on toward Blackthorn House as daylight thinned and the city tested what she could still carry. She had just reached the turn where Holborn bent toward the bridge road when a scream split the traffic to her right, sharp as a blade on glass, and a chestnut gelding reared so high its forelegs struck air above a line of hats and umbrellas. The groom on its lead rope lost his grip. The carriage behind it lurched sideways. A wheel mounted the curb. Karen saw 3 separate dangers in one glance. The horse's iron shoes flailing, the tilt of the carriage pole, and a slight figure in morning black stepping backward with nowhere left to step. The figure went down on slick stone with a sound she felt in her own teeth. At the same instant, a dispatch rider in blue livery swerved to avoid the horse, struck the edge of a water trough, and crashed hard enough to shear the leather strap from his satchel. Sealed packets burst across the street like startled birds, white paper darkening in mud. For one suspended heartbeat the crowd held still, breath pulled tight. Then everyone moved at once, and mostly away. A woman shrieked that there would be trampling. 2 men dragged a crate clear and left the fallen where they lay. Someone shouted for a constable but did not go find one. Karen did not think. She thrust her own locked box under the overhang of a shuttered apothecary door, dropped to her knees in sleet, and reached the nearest body first. The figure in morning black was a boy, no more than 12 or 13, narrow as a reed and swallowed by his formal coat, face white beneath rain and soot, eyes open but unfocused. His left sleeve was torn and blood ran thinly from a cut near the elbow bright against black wool. His breath came fast, then hitched. "Look at me," Karen said, one hand bracing his shoulder before another wheel could catch him. "Do not move yet." He tried and failed to sit, jaw set with the stubborn panic of a child trying not to cry before strangers. She pressed him back with firm fingers and turned her head toward the rider, who lay half-twisted near the gutter, boots tangled in reins, mouth slack. No one had touched him. A gentleman muttered that the man was drunk and stepped over a sealed packet without stooping. Karen's jaw tightened. She tore the bottom strip from her own skirt in one brutal pull, wrapped the strip around the boy's bleeding arm, and knotted it above the cut with practised speed. "Hold this hard." She placed his palm over the cloth and waited until he obeyed. Good. Keep your eyes on me. He blinked rain out of long lashes and whispered, voice breaking, My brother! Where is my brother? But Karen had no brother to offer him, only instructions. Your brother can find you if you stay conscious. Breathe with me. She set his hand, then crawled through filthy water to the rider, ignoring the cold that bit up through her stockings and the pain where the dispatch box had bruised her side. The rider's pulse was there, thready but present, fluttering under wet skin. She cut his cravat loose with her fingernails when knot and cloth would not yield. His chest was barely moving. His lips had gone blue at the corners. Karen flattened one hand over his sternum and pressed, counting under her breath the way a surgeon's apprentice had once taught her during a fever week when half the parish could not draw breath deep enough. 1, 2, 3. Water ran from her sleeves to his coat. She tilted his head, cleared mud from his mouth with the edge of her cuff, pressed again. Behind her boots skidded, curses rose, harness rang, and still no one knelt. On the fourth sequence he coughed violently and sucked in air so ragged it sounded like canvas tearing. Relief struck her so hard her hands shook once before steadying. "Stay with me," she said, almost fierce. She rolled him onto his side as another carriage rattled past, too close, and sprayed them both. Then she remembered the packets. Not one seal could be lost, not one if she wished to keep even an attic roof. She rose in a single motion, knees screaming, and began gathering papers from the street while traffic surged around her. Red wax stamps, blue ribbon ties, chancery tags, one packet already softening at the corner where filthy water had soaked through. She cradled the driest against her chest and held the dampest high as if elevation alone might save them. A porter finally stooped to hand her one envelope with 2 fingers, disgusted by mud. She took it without thanks. The boy in mourning had managed to drag himself toward the apothecary wall, and now sat shuddering, still clutching his arm, boots not yet fully grown into and dangling just above the flooded gutter. The rider tried to rise and failed. Karen looked up and saw rain thickening again, a silver sheet across the lane. 50 yards ahead, a print shop stood open, press wheels visible through the doorway, interior lit by 2 hanging lamps, and a fire low in the grate. "Can you stand if I pull?" she asked the boy. He nodded once, swallowing hard. She hauled him up by his good arm, then seized the rider's coat collar and dragged him in stops and starts through mud toward shelter. Dispatch packets trapped under her elbow. Her own locked box knocked back into her grasp with her knee as she passed. People stared. One laughed nervously and said she would ruin herself for strangers. She did not answer. Breath burned in her throat. By the time she reached the print shop threshold, her hands were numb, her back aflame, and all 3 bodies were shaking from cold. Inside, the heat was thin but real. Ink and oil and wet wool thickened the air. A printer with blackened thumbs swore at the mess on his floor, then stopped when he saw the rider's face and called for blankets. Karen lowered the boy onto a stack of folded broadsheets, eased the rider flat near the hearth, and lined the rescued packets on a dry counter in order of seal colour so she could count them without thinking. 12, then 13 when she found one stuck to her sleeve. Her own dispatch box remained locked. Thank God! She sank onto her heels for 1 second and wrote, on the reverse of a handbill, a surgeon's note in swift, upright copperplate. 2 men injured in Holborn spill. 1 with blunt chest trauma and interrupted breathing, now restored but unstable. 1 with arm laceration and probable concussion. Immediate attendance required. Bring splints and tincture for shock. She signed only K.S., folded the paper, and thrust it toward the printer's apprentice. Run to Mr. Hale in Fetter Lane. Do not stop. Tell him lives wait." The apprentice stared at the script before he stared at her face, as if the page and the woman did not reconcile. Then he ran. She had just tightened the rider's blanket when hoofbeats struck the lane outside in disciplined sequence, not the chaotic clatter of hired hacks, but a compact, hard rhythm that announced rank before title. Voices followed. Male, controlled. A command cut through rain. "Clear the entrance!" The printer straightened so quickly he knocked over a composing stick. Karen rose halfway, one hand still on the rider's shoulder. The doorway filled with a man in a rain-dark greatcoat, tall enough to force a stoop under the lintel, broad through chest and back, hat brim shedding water in sharp lines. 2 guards in black followed him and halted without speaking. The newcomer removed his gloves 1 finger at a time, gaze sweeping the room with military precision. First, the slight, mourning-clad boy by the press stack, then the rider, then the packets arranged by seal, then Karen, wet to the skin, hem torn away, knuckles split and ink-stained. His face was hard and spare, all winter angles. A white scar crossed the side of his jaw and vanished beneath his collar. His eyes, when they landed on her, were not merely pale. They were the colour of deep water under storm. Everyone in London knew that face from engravings and whispers. The Duke of Blackthorn did not need introduction. "Report," he said to no one, and therefore to everyone. The printer began, stumbled, pointed. 1 guard moved toward the boy. "Master Henry." Relief broke his discipline for a breath, then sealed again. He dropped to 1 knee to steady the child when Henry swayed. So the mourning-clad figure was his ward or kin. The Duke did not answer the guard. He had seen the note in the apprentice's departing hand through the open door. He extended his palm. "The message!" Karen held it out before the printer could touch it. Rain drummed the shutters. The Duke took the folded page, opened it, and read once. The room grew very quiet in the space between his first glance and his second. Something changed in his expression. Not warmth, not softness, but a minute stillness as if a hidden gear had locked. He looked from the script to Karen's face and back again, slower now. "Who wrote this?" he said. "I did, Your Grace." Her voice sounded rough from cold. His thumb traced the downstroke of 1 letter without smudging the ink. "Who taught you that hand?" "The rider is worsening," she said. "If you wish answers, summon the surgeon faster." His gaze lifted fully to hers then, hard enough to pin. "I do not repeat myself." Karen felt the old reflex rise, apology, lowering, silence. It died before reaching her mouth. The rider gave a wet cough near the hearth. She stepped past the Duke without touching him, and knelt again to adjust the blanket under the man's shoulders so he could breathe easier. 1 guard made a movement to stop her. The Duke raised 2 fingers. The guard froze. "Name," the Duke said behind her. "Karen Stewart." The surname landed. She heard it in the shift of breath near the doorway, in the printer's sudden attention, in the way 1 guard looked toward the sealed packets as if new arithmetic had entered the room. Blackthorn moved closer, boots leaving dark half-moons on the floorboards, and stopped at the edge of the hearthlight. Up close he smelled of rain, leather and cold iron. "Steward," he repeated, "of Chancery Lane." "My father kept chambers there, Your Grace." "Kept," he said, past tense. "He is dead." A beat passed. His face did not alter, but his next words came lower. "I am aware." She looked up then, startled despite herself. "Aware of what, sir?" He held up the note. Water from his coat hem tapped the boards in slow intervals. "Of this hand." The apprentice burst back through the door, breathless. announcing the surgeon had been found and was coming with a case. The Duke did not look away from Karen when he answered. "Good. Shut the door." The apprentice obeyed at once. Wind noise dropped. Inside the print shop, lamplight flickered over damp paper, over wounded men, over the Duke's unreadable face and Karen's torn sleeve and the mud drying dark on her skin. His voice, when he spoke again, was clipped enough to cut. "You will write another line for me now." Karen rose from the rider only when she was certain his breathing had settled into a rough but regular pull, then crossed to the counter where the printer kept his account book open beside a chipped inkwell. Her wet skirt clung to her calves. Her fingers shook from cold and effort, and she pressed them once against the warm iron lip of the grate before she took the pen. The Duke stood near enough that she could feel the draught of rain from his coat each time he moved. "What line, Your Grace?" He did not answer at once. His gaze remained on the page she had written for the surgeon, then shifted to the larger ledger before her. "Write this. The guarantor's liability shall not survive transfer absent witnessed consent of both signatories." She set the nib to paper. The line emerged in one continuous discipline of stroke and lift, copperplate as precise under strain as it was at a quiet desk. She did not blot. She did not hesitate at the long descender in liability. When she finished, she placed the pen down exactly where she had found it and stepped back. The Duke looked at the sentence, then at her hand, then at her face. He took a folded sheet from an inner pocket with the care of a man handling something worn at the edges by repeated opening. He did not show it to her. He only held it beside the fresh line and compared the slant, the spacing, the particular narrow loop of her Y. His jaw tightened once, not anger, recognition too sharp to hide. Behind them, Henry gave a small, strained sound in his throat. Karen turned immediately. The boy had gone very still, eyes fixed on the far wall, fingers whitening around the bandage she had tied. The guard at his side looked toward the Duke, awaiting instruction. Karen was already kneeling. "Henry!" She kept her voice low and plain. "Look at me. Not there. Here." His eyes shifted to her after a moment that stretched too long. He swallowed hard. "My head hurts." "I know. Stay with that pain and do not chase it. Can you tell me your age?" 12. "Good. 12 is strong enough to obey directions." She slid one hand lightly behind his neck without moving it and checked for heat at his brow. Too warm. Rain and shock and fear had set his body quivering. "Do not let him sleep yet," she said over her shoulder. One of the guards bristled at being addressed by a soaked copyist. "You forget yourself." "She is correct," said the Duke without raising his voice. "You will do as she says." The guard's mouth closed. Karen did not look up to see his face. She was counting Henry's breaths. Too shallow. She untied the black cravat at his throat and loosened the top fastening of his coat. "Your Grace, he needs warmth in layers, not all at once. Dry wool first. No spirits." The Duke stripped off his greatcoat before the last word left her mouth and handed it down. She hesitated for a fraction. The coat was heavy with rain, but lined and thick. Better than nothing. She wrapped it around Henry's shoulders and tucked it close at his sides. The boy shivered violently, then less. By the time the church bell outside struck 5, the print shop had grown crowded with consequence. The surgeon arrived with his case and a boy carrying splints and linen. 2 clerks from the yard appeared in the doorway, dripping and anxious, searching for the scattered dispatch packets by seal and count. A constable came to take names and stood uncertain when he recognized the Duke. The printer's wife brought a kettle without being asked and set cups in a row with trembling hands. Karen yielded space for the surgeon to examine the rider, then Henry. She answered questions before they were fully formed. How long unconscious? Less than a minute in the street, then confused. Bleeding volume. Not great, mostly from skin and superficial vessels. Breathing interruption in the rider. Yes, restored with pressure and airway clearing. The surgeon glanced up sharply at that, then back to his patient. Who instructed you in this? No one, formally. You may have saved him. She made no reply. Praise in public always came with a price later. She turned to the packets on the counter and began reordering them by destination from memory, preserving each mud-stained seal edge with the corner of a dry broadside. The yard clerks watched, first impatient, then unsettled when they realized she had already accounted for all 13 scattered items without opening one. A rustle of silk reached the doorway before the voice did. Rosewater followed it, cutting through ink and wet wool like a blade through paper. Mrs. Whitcomb entered with her hood half thrown back, cheeks flushed by haste and outrage, dove-grey skirts lifted clear of the threshold by gloved fingers. She took in the room in one sweep, the Duke, the guards, the surgeon, the boxes, Karen kneeling near the counter with mud to her hem and blood drying in a dark line above one bare ankle where torn cloth had exposed skin. There you are, she said, as if retrieving misplaced property. Karen, bring the dispatch at once. You have delayed enough. Karen rose slowly. Her body wanted to sway. She fixed her knees and did not permit it. There were injuries in the street, ma'am. Mrs. Whitcomb's smile had no softness in it. And London is full of them. You had one task. She moved to seize the locked dispatch box. Karen's hand closed over the handle first, not in defiance, but in duty. Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes flashed. Do not be theatrical. Give me the key. I do not have the key. Then the box. The Duke stepped between them without haste. He did not touch either woman. He did not need to. His presence altered the room's axis. The box remains where it is. Mrs. Whitcomb dipped into a curtsy shallow enough to signal respect and resentment in equal measure. Your Grace, this girl is prone to invention. She has likely opened what she was sent to carry. If there has been any mishandling, I shall discipline it. Karen felt heat rise under her skin despite the cold in her clothes. The old habit demanded silence. The old arithmetic warned that contradiction would cost shelter, food, any pretense of security. Henry made a small sound behind her and clutched the coat tighter around his shoulders. The rider coughed near the hearth. She looked at both and understood she could not purchase safety with cowardice. Not in this room. Not now. I opened nothing, she said, voice steady. The rider's packets were scattered. I recovered and counted them. All seals are intact. Mrs. Whitcomb gave a soft laugh, meant for an audience. Hear how she speaks, as if she were clerk and magistrate both. She speaks as a witness, said the Duke. Mrs. Whitcomb turned toward him, silk whispering. Your Grace is kind. She mistakes competence in penmanship for rank. I have fed and housed her out of pure duty since her father's death. The words landed like grit in the teeth. Fed and housed, Karen could feel each withheld meal in the memory of her own stomach. She could feel the attic damp in her joints. She kept her gaze level and answered only what could be proved. My father left trust income assigned to my maintenance. If that income reached me, I did not see it. The room went still. Even the printer's press seemed to pause between turns. Mrs. Whitcomb's expression sharpened. You ungrateful child. Enough. The Duke's voice was quiet. It carried farther than a shout. He held out his hand toward Karen, palm up. The key. I told her I do not have it, Your Grace. The box came locked from Chancery. Not that key. His eyes dropped to the pen resting near her. The key to this room is your account. Speak plainly. Who touched the scattered packets before you? Karen named them in order. A porter in brown cap handed me one with blue ribbon. No seal broken. No one else touched after I began collecting. The rider remained unconscious. The boy remained seated against the apothecary wall until I moved him. The constable began writing quickly. Mrs. Whitcomb shifted, then smiled again, too quickly this time. You see, she remembers details and mistakes that faculty for authority. I must insist she return with me immediately. Henry lifted his head from the coat collar, face pale and strained, and whispered, She kept me awake. She told me to breathe. Do not send her. Mrs. Whitcomb looked at him with brief irritation, then remembered who he was and softened her mouth. Poor child, you are confused. I'm not confused. His lower lip trembled once and steadied. She tore her dress for my arm. The surgeon, still cleaning his instruments, spoke without looking up. The bandage was correctly placed. So were the first interventions on the rider. If she departs now, the boy may become distressed again. Mrs. Whitcomb drew in breath through her nose, controlled and cold. My household arrangements are not for public review. Tonight they are, said the Duke. Karen did not realize he had moved until he stood just to her left, close enough that his shoulder blocked the lane draught from striking her wet bodice. He addressed the constable. Record this. Miss Stewart remains under my protection as material witness to roadway injuries and chain of custody for legal dispatch. Any attempt to remove her before statements are completed will be treated as obstruction. The constable swallowed and nodded at once. Yes, Your Grace. Mrs. Whitcomb's gloves tightened at the knuckles. You cannot mean to take instructions from a servant girl over her lawful guardian. At that, Karen made the choice she had postponed for years. She could have bent. She could have apologized. She could have accepted erasure one more evening and survived it. Instead, she lifted her chin and spoke in the same clear register she used for legal copy. I am 22 years of age. I am no child under guardianship. If you claim legal authority over my person, produce the instrument. Mrs. Whitcomb stared at her, as if at a door that had always opened inward and now would not move. The Duke's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. He turned to the yard clerks. You required a receiving signature for Blackthorn dispatch. Yes, Your Grace. You have 13 loose packets and 1 locked box. You will inventory all items in Miss Stewart's presence and mine. If any seal is compromised, you will state when and by whom observed. The clerks hurried to obey. Wax was checked. Twine was examined. Numbers were read aloud and repeated. Karen stood through the process, though her knees shook. When one clerk reached for a damp envelope carelessly, she stopped him. Not by the corner. The paper has lifted. Support from beneath. He flushed and did as told. She had no rank in the room. She had only exactness. It proved enough. During the counting, the Duke stepped away as if to examine the press plates. She did not notice him unfold the worn letter in his pocket again beside the fresh line she had written, comparing the same distinctive pressure at the start of each capital. The same restrained flourish. She never allowed herself on paid work unless writing for strangers who would never know her face. She did not see him refold it with unusual care and return it to the inner pocket over his heart. The inventory ended clean. No broken seal, no missing packet. The locked dispatch box remained untouched. The constable took statements from printer, apprentice, porter, surgeon, guards, and finally Karen. She gave only facts, no accusation, no ornament. When asked whether the rider had been negligent, she answered, No. The horse shied. He attempted to avoid a child in the carriage path. She defended a man who had no power to repay her, and no memory yet of her help. The Duke, signing his own statement at the next table, paused at that answer and looked at her for a long moment before setting down his pen. Outside, rain eased to a fine, hard mist. The light thinned toward evening blue. Mrs. Whitcomb remained near the door through all of it, trapped by rank and furious at delay, offering twice more to escort Karen home, each offer edged like a threat. Karen declined each one with formal politeness in front of witnesses. When the surgeon declared both patients stable enough for transport, the Duke issued orders in clipped sequence. "Henry to my carriage with blankets. Rider to St. Bartholomew under guard. Printer to retain floor sweepings and broken strap for incident record. Constable to Bow Street by morning." His gaze shifted to Karen's bare ankle, where blood had dried in a narrow line from where glass or stone had cut her during the scramble. "Sit. I'm able to stand. Sit." The command carried not dominance, but finality. She obeyed because her body had begun to tremble beyond concealment. He took the cleanest strip of linen from the surgeon's tray and handed it to her first, allowing her the dignity of binding her own skin. When her fingers failed at the knot from cold, he waited one beat, then tied it himself with efficient hands that never brushed more of her than necessity required. Mrs. Whitcomb made a small disbelieving sound. "Your Grace, this is excessive. I assure you she is accustomed to roughness." The Duke did not look at her. "I'm aware of what she is accustomed to." The words were simple. They struck harder than accusation. Karen felt them as both wound and shelter, and did not know which frightened her more. A footman appeared at the door to announce the carriage was ready. The Duke turned to Karen at last. "You will accompany my household to Blackthorn House to complete document verification and witness deposition." Mrs. Whitcomb stepped forward. "She will return with me." "No," said the Duke. It was one syllable. It ended the argument. Karen reached for the locked dispatch box. It was heavier now that adrenaline had drained from her blood. One of the guards moved to take it. She hesitated, then relinquished it only when the Duke said, "It remains in your sight." She wrapped her damp shawl tighter, checked once that Henry was being lifted carefully, and gathered the 13 recovered packets into a cloth satchel for transfer. As she passed the threshold, the printer's wife pressed a warm cup into her hands. Karen looked down, startled, and found weak tea with too much sugar, the first sweetness she had tasted all day. She drank because refusal would waste kindness, and kindness had been too scarce to squander. At the carriage step she turned once toward the print shop floor where muddy water still marked where strangers had fallen, and where she had knelt. The room smelled of ink and smoke and wet wool and changed fate. She had entered it as expendable labour with a torn hem and a deadline that threatened her bed. She left it named in legal statements, carrying evidence no one could quietly erase, and followed by a Duke who had watched every choice she made when she thought only of keeping others alive. He climbed in after Henry and sat opposite, rain-dark hair unpowdered, face carved back into reserve. The carriage jolted forward. Wheel noise swallowed the lane. Karen held the satchel of packets with both hands, feeling each seal edge through cloth. For several streets, no one spoke. Then, without preamble, the Duke reached into his coat, withdrew the worn, folded letter, and placed it on the seat between them. "I asked who taught you that hand," he said, eyes on her, voice low and exact. "At Blackthorn House you will answer." The carriage rocked over ruts and iron seams, and the folded letter lay between them like a blade set flat on velvet. Karen kept both hands on the satchel of recovered packets, feeling damp paper through the cloth, counting edges by touch to steady her breath. Henry had curled along the opposite seat with the Duke's coat around his narrow shoulders, lashes dark against a fever-bright cheek, mouth parted on shallow sleep. He had fought too long. Rain tapped the roof in thinning bursts. Lamps slid past in yellow streaks. The Duke did not move to reclaim the letter. He watched her with that same unyielding focus he had given the wounded in the print shop, as if omission itself were a form of falsehood. "At Blackthorn House you will answer," he had said. Now he said, "Open it." Karen set the satchel down carefully and took the fold with fingers gone stiff from cold. The paper was good rag stock, expensive once, softened now at the creases by repeated handling. She recognised the hand at once because it was hers, though she had not seen this page in months. To a father who has not slept for fear his son will not wake, you are not weak because you count his breaths, mark the hour, cool linen at the neck, keep the room dark at noon. If the heat rises beyond sense, call for help early, not late. K.S. Her throat tightened. She read the line twice, though there was no need. She had written it in her attic with candle smoke in her eyes and rain coming through the slate seam. She had signed only initials. She had posted it before dawn and never expected to see it again. She looked up. "Where did you get this?" "It came to me through St. Bride's correspondence, among replies to inquiries sent under seal." His voice was low enough not to wake Henry. "There were 7 in total, all in this hand." She stared at him, then down at the page again. "You kept them?" "Yes." The carriage turned hard at a corner. Henry stirred with a small pained sound. Karen reached instinctively, then stopped when she realised the Duke had already braced the child with one broad hand at his shoulder, holding him steady without waking him. He did not take his eyes from her. "When I saw your note in the print shop," he said, "I recognised the stroke before I recognised the woman." Outside, a costermonger shouted and was swallowed by wheel noise. Inside, the space between them narrowed without either body moving. Karen could hear her own pulse in her ears. She had thought those letters vanished into parish boxes and strangers' hearth fires. She had never imagined one might be read under a ducal roof by this man, at this hour, with his son breathing unevenly between them. She folded the page along its old line and set it back on the seat with care. "If this is accusation, Your Grace, I answered inquiries as charity. I took no payment. I made no claim beyond common sense." "It is not accusation. Then why test me in a print shop with wounded men on the floor?" "Because forged script has already destroyed one household named Stuart." His jaw set. "And because I do not permit uncertainty near my son." The answer was blunt and clean. It struck her as honest in a way politeness never was. She lowered her gaze to her own hands. Mud had dried in the lines of her skin. Ink stained her thumb joint black. A cut along her knuckle had opened again. She had been handled all day as burden, witness, liability, convenience. No one had asked what it cost her to hold steady. No one except this hard, controlled man who asked as if truth were an instrument he meant to use. By the time they crossed Fleet Street, the rain had thinned to mist, and the carriage windows ran with pale water instead of sheets. The Duke reached into his coat once more and withdrew a second folded paper, newer, sealed with black wax, already broken. "This is the dispatch copy abstract from the recovered loose packets," he said. "Read the margin note." She hesitated. "May I?" His eyes flicked to her, and she understood he had heard the habit in that question. Permission requested before touching paper. Permission requested for breath, for heat, for bread. He held out the page. "You may." She read by the lamp fixed to the carriage wall, angling the paper to catch the light. The instrument concerned guarantor liability tied to shipping bonds. The margin annotation attempted to extend liability beyond transfer, converting a bounded debt into a permanent claim. The script in the margin imitated office hand at first glance. At second glance it failed in pressure at the turns, in pen lift where a practised clerk would have joined, in the cramped capital that betrayed someone writing slowly while pretending speed. "This note is added," she said. "After execution, different ink, different hand." "From whose? Not my father's. Not yours. Not any chancery clerk trained in formal copy." She looked up. "A domestic imitator, someone who has watched legal script without mastering cadence." The Duke's face did not change, but his fingers tightened once on the paper edge. "Continue." "She writes with a rightward lean. She attempts to suppress. See the second S in transfer. It drifts. There is also a habitual hook on final Y, then an abrupt stop, as if she fears flourish will expose her." Karen swallowed. "I have seen that hook in household account initials." "Whose initials?" She did not answer at once. Naming could not be recalled once spoken. It could strip the last shelter she had known, cruel as that shelter was. It could also place Henry, the rider, and the legal chain under a lie, if she stayed silent now. She chose. "Mrs. Whitcomb's." The Duke nodded, as if confirming a number already calculated. "I reached the same conclusion." A strange cold moved through her, different from wet wool in winter. "Then why ask me?" "Because you are witness, not conjecture. Because truth must survive courtrooms, not drawing rooms." His gaze held hers. "Because she has used your hand for years and expected you never to speak against hers." The carriage slowed. Through the blurred glass she saw iron gates, then the long dark approach beyond, gravel shining wet under lamps. Blackthorn House rose ahead in stone and shadow, too large for comfort, windows lit in disciplined rows. She had carried papers to grand houses before and entered by service doors, unseen and unnamed. This time the main carriage rolled to the front steps and did not turn aside. Henry woke as the wheels stopped. He flinched at the shift, then looked for Karen first. She leaned toward him before she considered rank. "You are safe," she said. "Breathe slowly." His fingers found her sleeve and held. The Duke watched that small grip, then opened the carriage door himself before the footman could reach it. Cold air rushed in. Lantern light cut across his scarred jaw. He gave orders, without raising his voice. "Mrs. Davies to the blue schoolroom. Fire lit now. Physician summoned for Master Henry's head and lungs. Warm broth. No spirits." A housemaid curtsied and ran. A footman took Henry gently, and the boy released Karen only when she promised, "I am near." Mrs. Davies appeared within moments, grey-haired, steady-eyed, apron immaculate despite the hour. She took one look at Karen's soaked hem and bleeding ankle, and did not ask useless questions. "Miss Stewart, with me." Karen moved to follow. The Duke's voice stopped her. "Not yet." She turned back on the step, one hand on the cold stone balustrade for balance. He stood one stair below, rain still beading on his coat, hat in hand now, dark hair damp at the temples. The household had withdrawn just far enough to grant privacy without neglecting protocol. He spoke in the same clipped register, but something in it had shifted from command to vow. "You will not return to Whitcomb House tonight." She drew breath carefully. "Your Grace, I cannot remain without terms. I am not a foundling to be placed where convenient." "State them." It came so quickly she almost missed it. No lecture, no correction, no reminder of rank. She met his gaze fully. "My name remains mine. My hand remains mine. Any work I do is entered under my own signature and paid to me directly." "Agreed." "I will not be called servant in legal matters where I am witness." "Agreed." She hesitated, then added the hardest one. If testimony is required, I speak facts without coaching." His answer came at once. "I would accept nothing else." Silence held one breath, then two. Rain clicked from the roofline into stone basins. Somewhere inside, Henry coughed and was soothed by Mrs. Davis's low murmur. Karen became suddenly aware of the ache in every joint, of water freezing at the edge of her collar, of exhaustion pulling at the base of her skull. She had crossed a city in sleet with hunger and threat at her back, knelt in traffic, dragged strangers from mud, stood against the woman who had ruled her by deprivation, and now stood on ducal steps bargaining for the right to keep her own name. The world had altered in increments so precise she could mark each one. The Duke held out his hand, not to take possession, only to steady her down the final wet step where her torn boot slipped on stone. She accepted because refusal would be pride at the expense of bone. His grip was warm, firm and brief. Inside, heat struck her face hard enough to sting. The entry hall smelled of wax and cedar, not rose water. No one looked through her. They looked to him, then to her, and waited for instruction. He gave it. "Miss Stewart is under my protection as witness and correspondent. She is to be addressed as Miss Stewart. She is to have dry clothes, food, and the library fire in 1/4 hour." A younger footman blinked, surprised only for an instant, then bowed. "Yes, Your Grace." "Mrs." Davies led Karen down a corridor lined with portraits darkened by varnish and age. "You are trembling, miss," she said, practical and kind. "We shall mend that first." In a small retiring room, she produced hot water, linen, and a plain wool gown, borrowed from the housekeeper's stores, then set bread, broth, and a dish of stewed apples on a side table, as if such care were routine. Karen sat because her knees would no longer negotiate. When she tried to tie the bandage at her ankle with wet fingers, Mrs. Davies knelt and did it with quiet efficiency. "Master Henry asked for you," the housekeeper said, while fastening the knot. "His Grace told him he must let the physician work first. He obeyed. He does not obey easily when frightened." Karen managed a faint nod. "He was very brave in the street." Mrs. Davis's expression softened by a degree. "That is what His Grace said of you." 20 minutes later, dry and still shivering but upright, Karen was shown into the library. A fire burned high. Shelves rose to the ceiling in dark ranks. On the central table lay the locked dispatch box, now opened under witness, its contents arranged in careful stacks. Original instrument, copies, ledgers, and one slim notebook bound in cracked red leather. The Duke stood at the far end, coat changed, cravat replaced, face no less severe for the domestic order restored around him. He gestured to the chair nearest the fire. "Sit, eat if you have not." "I have eaten." "Good." He waited until she was seated before speaking again. That waiting, that refusal to pace or crowd or fill silence, carried more force than any raised tone. He placed the 7 anonymous letters beside the disputed debt instrument and set a clean sheet between them. "Write one line," he said. "Any line you choose." Karen took the pen. The nib touched paper. For a moment she could not think of legal formulae, of evidentiary phrasing, of defensive courtesy. She wrote the sentence her father had said in a sunny room long before accounts collapsed and Rosewater entered the house. "A clear hand is a promise to the future." She set the pen down. The Duke looked at the line, then at the old letters, then back to her face with an expression stripped of armour for one unguarded second. "I knew your hand before I knew your name," he said. He did not move away after saying it. He did not soften it with apology. He stood perfectly still, as if the truth itself had fixed him to the floor and In that stillness, Karen understood that whatever came next in courts and ledgers and drawing rooms, this could not be unsaid. Karen held his gaze and did not trust her voice yet, because the words had struck the centre of her like a bell and left it ringing. The fire snapped. Rain ticked once against the tall window and then stopped. Somewhere in the corridor a door opened, footsteps approached in haste, and a knock landed sharp on the library panel. The Duke did not look away from her when he said, "Enter." A blackthorn guard stepped in, wet at the shoulders, hat in hand. "Your Grace." Bow Street runner returned. Mrs. Whitcomb was intercepted at the North Posting Yard with 2 trunks, a cash box, and household ledgers wrapped in oilcloth. She demanded immediate departure for York. The runner requests direction. Karen felt the room tilt and then steady. So that was why Rosewater had smelled stronger at the print shop door than haste required. Mrs. Whitcomb had already been packed for flight. "Where is she now?" the Duke asked. "In the small withdrawing room under watch. She requests to speak to you alone." "No." His voice was iron-laid flat. "She will speak before a magistrate." He glanced to Karen. "You will hear this plainly, Miss Stewart. She does not leave custody tonight." The guard bowed. "Yes, Your Grace." "And the items seized?" "Cash box sealed. Ledgers intact. 1 packet of correspondence tied in blue ribbon." "Bring them here. Send word to Bow Street that hearing is requested at first light. Include fraud, coercion and forged endorsement on Stewart Trust instruments." When the door shut again, Karen realised her hands had tightened on the chair arms until her fingers hurt. She released them slowly. The Duke moved to the sideboard, poured water, and set the glass within reach without comment. It was the first time in years that a man of rank had noticed strain in her before she named it. By midnight, the library table had become a court before the court. The seized cash box sat to the left, iron corners dented, Whitcomb crest scratched and nearly polished away. The oilcloth bundle lay opened to reveal 3 household ledgers, 1 receipt book, and 2 folded tenancy drafts. The blue ribbon packet contained letters from clerks requesting copied pages and remittance dates, each addressed to Mrs. Whitcomb, each payment line marked, received in a hand that tried too hard at elegance. Karen read until her eyes burned. The Duke stood opposite, sleeves rolled, cravat loosened by 1 exact finger's width. He asked no needless questions. He did not interrupt when she traced a line or counted columns under her breath. "This entry," she said at last, touching a page with the back of her knuckle to avoid smudging. "Stewart Maintenance dispersed quarterly. Signed M.W." "Did you receive it?" "No. Next." She turned 2 leaves. "Copying income from Gray's Inn clerks. Paid weekly. No wages issued to copyist. Notation says household offset." Her mouth thinned. "Offset for bread and coal," she denied. He nodded once. "Mark it." He pushed a clean sheet toward her. She made a list in her own hand. Date, page, amount, discrepancy, probable legal character. Fraud, conversion, coercive deprivation. On the final line she paused, then wrote, "Claimed guardianship over adult without instrument produced." A second knock came. Mrs. Davies entered with news from the blue schoolroom. "Master Henry is sleeping at last, Your Grace. Fever has fallen after broth and tincture. Physician says lungs are clear enough and head injury mild. He asks for Miss Stewart when he wakes, but he will keep till morning." Karen closed her eyes for 1 breath of relief. Henry safe. 1 thread tied. Mrs. Davies's knowing glance moved from Karen's ink-stained fingers to the ledgers, then to the Duke's face. She had looked at Karen once in the corridor as if weighing truth against protocol. Now she gave a tiny nod, as if her weighing was done. The dispatch rider's outcome came just before dawn. A note arrived from St. Bartholomew. carried by the same apprentice who had run for the surgeon. Rider conscious, breathing stable, recalled collision and Miss Stuart's aid. Packets untouched after fall except where rescued from mud. The Duke handed the note to Karen. "External confirmation," he said. "Chain of custody stands." At first light they went to Bow Street in separate carriages under guard. The courtroom smelled of damp wool, lamp oil, and old paper. Clerks arranged dockets in stacks. A magistrate with silver brows and ink on his cuff took the bench and read the charges without flourish. Mrs. Whitcomb stood within the rail in dove-grey silk gone rumpled at the hem, rosewater unable to sweeten panic. She looked at Karen once, hard and bright, the same look that had always meant punishment delayed, never cancelled. The magistrate began with witnesses to injury and custody. Printer, apprentice, porter in the brown cap, constable, surgeon. Each gave facts. Each placed Karen in the centre of events, as actor, not ornament. When the magistrate asked the porter whether any seal had been broken in street mud, the man swallowed and said, "No, sir. She near bit my hand off for touching the corner wrong." "Begging pardon, miss." A dry ripple moved through the room and died at once. Then came the papers. The Blackthorn receiving clerk produced the 13 recovered packets, dried overnight under supervision, each sealed and logged with time. He produced the locked dispatch box contents, logged upon opening in the Duke's library in presence of 2 guards, Mrs. Davies and Miss Stuart. He produced the broken strap and floor sweepings retained by the print shop, now bagged and noted as containing leather fragments and street grit only. No wax shards, no cut twine. Physical evidence accounted for, item by item. The magistrate turned to Handwriting. "Miss Stuart, step forward." She did. Her boots were still damp at the seams. Her ankle ached where linen pressed the cut. She stood straight. "You are asked to write this line as dictated," he read slowly. "The guarantor's liability shall not survive transfer absent witnessed consent of both signatories." She wrote in one motion. The courtroom quiet sharpened a round nib on paper. "Mrs. Whitcomb, the same line." Mrs. Whitcomb took the pen as if it were beneath her. She wrote with practised poise for the first 3 words, then tightened at transfer. Her final Y hooked and halted. The magistrate called for the disputed margin annotation. 3 pages were laid side by side on a felt board, Karen's exemplar, Mrs. Whitcomb's exemplar, and the forged note on the debt instrument. Blackthorn's legal man identified pen angle, pressure, and lift points. Karen did not speak until asked, "Miss Stuart, do you affirm your prior statement that the forged margin hand is not yours?" "I affirm." "On what basis?" "Cadence and fear," Karen said, voice level. "The writer imitates confidence and stops at each risk point. My hand moves through legal formula as one shape. This hand assembles shape from memory. Can you identify whose?" "Yes, Mrs. Whitcomb's." Mrs. Whitcomb snapped, "Lies. She is vindictive and unstable. I fed her out of charity." The magistrate did not raise his tone. "You will answer questions, not manufacture speeches." He lifted one ledger entry. "Quarterly maintenance drawn in Miss Stuart's name. Did you disburse?" Mrs. Whitcomb's silence lasted long enough to convict itself. By noon, the ruling was entered. Fraud on trust income. Forged endorsement on transferred liability. Coercive abuse by deprivation. No valid guardianship over Miss Stuart, adult. Immediate seizure of relevant accounts pending restitution order. Mrs. Whitcomb's petition to reclaim Miss Stuart's labour was struck from record. Guards moved in at a nod. Silk rustled once, harsh and frightened now as she was led out through the same public room where she had once corrected Karen like furniture. power inverted with witnesses present. No one in that room would forget it. Outside Bow Street, sleet had cleared to a thin winter sun. The Duke did not offer triumph. He offered a sequence. First Henry, then documents. At Blackthorn House, the physician met them in the schoolroom and gave his report with professional brevity. Master Henry slept 6 hours. No chest rattle this morning. Head pain reduced. Keep him quiet for 2 days and away from bright rooms. Henry, pale but upright in blankets, reached for Karen's hand and held it against his sleeve. "You came back," he whispered, as if this were the most uncertain fact in England. She answered, "I said I would." In the library, the final accounting waited. The magistrate's clerk had sent certified extracts. The Duke placed them beside the 7 anonymous letters and the restored Stuart Trust schedule. He slid one instrument to Karen. "Read clause 4, she read aloud. "Income share formally diverted is restored to Miss Karen Stuart. Independent control, payable directly, with arrears calculated from date of majority." She stopped, breath catching once. "This is enforceable. It is filed." He placed a second paper down. "Employment instrument. Legal correspondent to Blackthorn Estates and Shipping Office. Salary listed. Signature line bears your name only." She traced the inked line where Karen Stuart waited in blank. "No household dependency clause. Removed. No surrender of separate funds. Never included." The fire burned steady between them. The house had quieted into afternoon. From above came a child's cough and Mrs. Davies's calm reply. Karen thought of attic drip, withheld bread, pages copied under another name. She thought of Bow Street benches and the sound of silk under guard. She thought of a folded letter preserved by a man who did not preserve anything without purpose. The Duke laid the old, unsigned letters beside the new legal forms. "Stay," he said, "by choice, not by debt." The words were plain. They held no trap she could detect. She met his gaze and answered with equal plainness, "I will stay if I keep my name and my hand." "You will." She signed the employment instrument first, Karen Stuart, loop, stem, lift. Then she signed the restitution acknowledgement. Then, after a pause that felt like setting down a burden carried for years, she took the 7 old letters and placed them in the red leather notebook from the dispatch box. Not hidden now, only kept. At dusk she was given rooms on the 2nd floor, small and warm, with a dry roof and a desk near a window that did not leak. Her old shawl hung by the hearth. Her split gloves lay mended on the chair. On the desk sat the recovered dispatch box key and the first packet for her review under her own name. Down the corridor Henry slept without fever. In Bow Street records, fraud had a verdict. In Blackthorn ledgers, her wages had a line. When she entered the library once more to return a signed memorandum, the Duke looked up from the fire and rose, not as a master to a servant, but as one witness to another. The forged past was closed, the evidence filed, and Karen Stuart's hand at last belonged only to her.